They were two of the greatest politicians Britain has ever produced.
One was born in a Welsh shoemaker's household and the other at Blenheim Palace.
They seem to have almost nothing in common.
Yet for more than 40 years, David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill would be allies, rivals, rescuers, and occasionally each other's worst enemies.
This is episode 1 of our series on Churchill and Lloyd George, Paths to Power.
Welcome to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me as ever is Professor Richard Toye, the erudite Englishman to my bright-eyed boyo.
How are you, Warren?
I'm doing great, Richard.
I gather you're actually a Welsh citizen.
I'm, in fact, a Welshman, an honorary Welshman. I'm pretty sure no one in Wales would agree with that, but on paper, it's true.
I have some Welsh credentials insofar as my grandfather was born there and I lived there for a few years and learned to speak just enough Welsh to say, how much pocket money do you get each week, which they taught us in school and comes in very useful when I visit the Principality. Let's go to our topic, which is, of course, the relationship between these two very impressive, important individuals whose careers spanned decades and really defined the first part of the 20th century. Churchill now being so much better known and better remembered outside Wales, of course. Lloyd George, of course, still a name to counter with inside Wales, but really Churchill's overshadowed Lloyd George. Yet at the time, in the first years of their career, it was the other way round, and Lloyd George, if anything, overshadowed Churchill.
Well, and I mean, what's really interesting for me, and Shamai to all my Welsh listeners, but when I moved there, I obviously, and was a professor at Aberystwyth, and I would tell people the work that I did, and they'd say, Winston Churchill, you mean the guy that worked with David Lloyd George? And I've always, as an American, that's very funny to me. Most Americans probably don't even know who this man is. And it's remarkable that at the time, he was the towering giant in a sense, and Churchill was his protege. So I think it's a really good idea to look at how these men developed, how different they were, and how great. And I'm also happy to say to our listeners, we have something of an expert with us today in you, because you have written a book.
I have, and it is called Lloyd George and Churchill, Rivals for Greatness, and it is available at all good bookshops and probably a few lousy ones too. But let's start with how these two men came to power, how their paths eventually came to overlap so that they became both rivals and to an extent friends, although I think it's always a very tricky relationship. Now there's a sort of a quotation which I like from Stanley Baldwin in 1930, of course, was a Conservative Prime Minister. And he said, Lloyd George was born a cad and never forgot it. Winston was born a gentleman and never remembered it.
I think that that's a perfect way to frame this. I think it's really interesting to explore the real differences in how these two men, despite being similar in that they're egotists and they're both driven by themselves. So David Lloyd George was born in 1863, just 2 years before Joseph Lister first used carbolic acid as an antiseptic. I don't know why that's important, but it is.
Well, it's important because this is thinking about the changing world in which they lived, so that we now take antiseptics for granted, right? We also take the telephone for granted, and Churchill was born in 1874, which was 2 years before Alexander Graham Bell made the first telephone call. So they were being born into a world without reliable antiseptics, without telephones. But by the time they died, well, actually, Lloyd George just missed out on the atomic age because he died a few months before the first atomic test. But by the time that Churchill died, 60, there were satellites, so that there's this incredible shift over the course of their lifetimes. I think probably Churchill of the two was more interested in science, was fascinated by this technology, but it's just to really make the point that they were living in this so rapidly changing world. And I think that what the point about that is that there was this assumption of progress, which was already there in Victorian Britain before they were born, before these particular new technologies came out. But just the idea that the world is, although there's got lots of problems, it's basically getting better and better and better, and these technologies are proof of that. And that is crucial because I think it influences both of their political outlooks.
Well, no, I agree with you certainly about the era of progress, you might call that. But what's really interesting is they're quite different. They're born to quite different circumstances and mirror each other almost. So David Lloyd George was born in Manchester in January 1863.
Yeah,
And he
of course, that's very interesting because he's Welsh, but actually he was born in Manchester, right?
Right, so he would use that. He would use that Manchester industrial background, I think, later on. But he grew up as a in a Welsh shoemaker's cottage. And so he had this like he was a craftsman. Now he's not impoverished, but he's very much a part of a working class identity.
Yeah, I suppose that he's in that liminal zone between the working classes and sort of the lower middle classes because he was this Uncle Lloyd, key figure in his life after his father died, rather young. It was not they were not poor. It was not a lavish lifestyle by any means, but they weren't going hungry, and so this he was born into this respectable family, and I think that respectableness was sort of very important in terms of religious nonconformity, and this is the really key divide. It's a really important divide in Britain, but perhaps even more intensely in Wales between Anglicans, the people who attend the state church, the Church of England, and those who disagree with the tenets of the Church of England and go to chapel rather than to church, and they have a very unique culture.
Right. Well, and speaking to your point there, Lloyd George is already imbued with a political identity. He's not afraid to rebel, right? And we know that from a very early age. What did he do, Richard?
Well, what was really controversial was schooling, and it's like one of those trigger issues now, which you think, well, why does it matter exactly what kinds of religious observances, if any, take place in a school? But he had to go to an Anglican school, even though he was a nonconformist. So because he and sort of the other children were Anglicans, they sort of refused to sort of cite the creed. In other words, to do this particular sort of go and enunciate this particular Anglican formulation when put under pressure to do so, and they just stand silent. So this is leadership, it's rebellion, but this was a big deal at the time and to do it at such a young age. And ultimately, Lloyd George, like Churchill, had a bit of a big head. He had a very good opinion of himself. And I think you can see this building from his successfully taking a stand against rather pompous establishment figures.
Well, let me ask you a psychohistory question, and that is this success is standing up for this. He obviously had his uncle, who was this master craftsman, who doted on him. What for Lloyd George did that help create a base psychological healthy environment for him?
Well,
Do you think?
I suppose this goes back to the differences and the similarities between Churchill and Lloyd George, so that Lloyd George was really spoiled, I would say, and perhaps Churchill, who was spoiled in a rather different way in the sense that he never wanted for luxuries, etc., etc. He didn't have this close relationship with a kind of, parental figure.
I mean, it's a borderline neglect.
Yes, so there's this famous letter where Churchill is writing to his mother at the age 16, please do come to see me. I've been disappointed so many times when he's at school. So that's heartbreaking. But I think that what they've got in common is that they never really learnt to look after themselves properly. And I don't know if it's a learned helplessness, but neither of them really knew how to dress themselves, or at least I do think I do wonder with Churchill during the various wars that he was in, surely he had to dress himself, surely he must have managed. But as an adult, as a fairly wealthy man, or often living beyond his means, you might say, he's basically got people who will, stand behind him and button his shirt for him. And I think that perhaps even more extreme cases, Lloyd George really never knew how to do these things called buttons.
Right. But I think it's interesting that you have these different upbringings, different situations, but they both inadvertently produce a similar engine. You can see when you're talking about Lloyd George, he's got a high opinion of himself from very early on. Churchill believes, I mean, that he's a glowworm. and he has this militarist view. He joins the military, as we've talked about. After the third attempt, he got into Sandhurst. He was all about adventure, trying to get his name out there in Cuba and India and Sudan. He's writing these dispatches. He's publishing books. He's a tornado of action, all about pushing himself out there to be known, to try, in my opinion, maybe try to fill that hole, that neglectful hole that his parents had created by getting an adoration from the public. And
Yeah.
eventually it was successful for him because that's how he entered politics in 1900. After a failed by-election the previous year, he was able to come in 1900.
Yes, and also, of course, by this point, again, it's worth emphasizing Lloyd George's seniority because he'd become a solicitor, made a successful legal career. Again, there'd been sort of cause célèbres around nonconformist cases, a sort of famous case where an Anglican priest had refused to allow a nonconformist to be buried within a sort of Anglican graveyard. It all goes to court, and Lloyd George's side wins. And that does make him a local celebrity. And in 1890, a bit older than Churchill was when he became MP, but not that much older, he becomes an MP, and he basically retains that North Wales seat until he gives it up in 1945 and enters the House of Lords. So he holds it continuously for 55 years, in contrast to Churchill, who switches constituency, loses by-elections, has to come back. Lloyd George was much better at building local loyalty.
And what's interesting is on the national stage, they both come in not as a young man in a hurry and a rising young Welshman. And I think it's really interesting that Churchill's maiden speech is specifically comes after a speech by Lloyd George, who was a pro-Boer, and Churchill having served in the Boer War.
Yeah, well, this is crucial, really, because they are on different sides. Of course, they're in different parties as well. Lloyd George, we should remind people, was a liberal and remained so all his life. Again, Churchill switching parties twice, of course, starts as a conservative. And so when he makes that maiden speech, he is a Tory. And he has just become this hero of the Boer War, whereas Lloyd George has been an opponent of the war. And you've got to say, both in very different ways, have been extremely brave, in that obviously Churchill had risked his life in multiple wars and been in prison, escaped from prison, etc., which we're definitely going to do a jailbreak series at some point on Churchill in South Africa. Whereas Lloyd George really had risked his life and limb by opposing this war. Wasn't the only person to do so. And in the area, his local area, he was going to have more support for that position. But there's a famous example in Birmingham where he has to escape from a public meeting, which is turned nasty, in the sort of policeman's uniform as a disguise. And so he was going into politically hostile areas, taking the risk potentially of really being lynched. It is fascinating that these two, who start from these very different positions, end up actually as collaborators. I guess it is just worth saying that Lloyd George, although he opposed this war, he wasn't opposed to the British Empire in general, thought it was a good thing. And so that was something that he and Churchill actually had in common from slightly different perspectives. But I guess that Lloyd George's line was, I don't oppose all wars, I oppose dumb wars.
I could see that bothering Churchill.
Let's go to a break and then talk in detail about that first meeting between Lloyd George and Churchill in 1901 and its aftermath, and the great schism which broke out in British politics caused by Joseph Chamberlain and his proposals for so-called tariff reform. Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour, where we're discussing David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill. I'm Richard Toye, and with me is Dr. Warren Dockter, the Anthony Hopkins to my Simon Ward.
And I'm always happy to be played by Anthony Hopkins.
I'll call him and see if he's available for the biopic.
I would very much like that. So we were just jumping back into when David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill first met. Now, this was after the speeches that we were talking about. And
Yeah.
they
So
met at
this
the
is
House bar basically immediately after that, right?
yeah. So this is February 1901, immediately after Churchill's maiden speech. And remember, when we say the bar of the House of Commons, in this case, we mean actually standing very close to where you enter the formal zone of the chamber, not the bar as in down the pub. Although, of
Yeah.
course, there are bars and pubs and so on in the House of Commons that people do go to. Again, just in passing, Lloyd George, never a great drink, not absolutely teetotal, but again, on that nonconformist culture, which again, obviously is a difference with Churchill, who we've debated in the past exactly how much he drank to excess, but it would be undeniable that regular drinking was, well, defined by one doctor in the United States for him as medically essential during Prohibition.
Oh, no, no, no. But at the bar, Lloyd George says to Winston Churchill, "Judging from your sentiments, you are standing against the light," which is a remarkable put down.
Yeah. And Churchill replies, "You take a singularly detached view of the British Empire." So again, this is the key debate or divide between them over the merits of the Boer War. Now, actually, what is interesting is that in that speech, Churchill has shown some sympathy for the Boers, even though he's in favour of the war, by saying, "If I were a Boer, I wish that I would be fighting in the field," which kind of causes people to draw breath or to disapprove of this. So characteristically, Churchill is in favour of reconciliation with the Boers after
Yeah.
their defeat. He doesn't want to see them have their faces ground in the dirt. And so that means that although ostensibly Lloyd George and Churchill are far apart, once the war is over, there is scope for them to bury the hatchet on this one.
Well, then things begin to alter in 1903, and they actually become aligned. And interestingly, they become aligned around Joseph Chamberlain's proposal of tariff reform, which is something not entirely detached to us today in the United States. But of course,
Yeah,
Britain had always traditionally been a free trade country.
absolutely. And so this is a really pivotal moment, one might say, because Chamberlain, who had started out as a liberal but was now a so-called liberal unionist who was allied with the Conservative Party, so really, to most intents and purposes, a conservative, essentially proposes in a speech in 1903 that Britain should move towards protectionism for not just for Britain itself, as in the island, but for the whole empire. And this just wreaks havoc within the Conservative Party. It splits. Again, you made the modern comparison with tariffs. You might say it was a split a bit like the split in the Conservative Party over Brexit 10 years or more ago. And so it leads to a real civil war, which the protectionists really end up winning, but at the cost of damaging their own party. And certainly, Churchill is a convinced free trader, and so much so that this really becomes a defining issue in his decision to switch party. And you could also say that there were those who thought that this switch in party, as he becomes sort of more sympathetic to the Liberals, was really due to the fact that he thought that the Liberals were going to be in power, possibly for a long time, and therefore that his move was motivated, at least in part, by grubby self-interest.
Right. Well, and that's always been the challenge against him. And I think that you can see the engine in Churchill. Hey, I believe in free trade, but also this might be a personal moment, a political moment to switch parties so I can be in power. So there's both Churchill, the thinker, principled, enlightened imperialist, but
Yeah.
there's also Churchill, the political opportunist. And he sees how these things can link up together by allying himself with Lloyd George in particular.
Yeah, he takes a little while, I would say, from the mid 1903 when Chamberlain makes his famous speech to 31st of May 1904 when Churchill makes this final break from the Conservatives. Remember, of course, he's had a lot of problems with his own constituency. The sort of the activists there don't like the line that he's been taking, and eventually I think people have seen this coming for a long time, but he crosses the floor, as we say in British terminology. He literally moves from one side of the House of Commons to the other, in this case, sit on the opposition benches, sits down next to Lloyd George. So there is clearly an incipient alliance between the two. But I think Churchill would have liked to have been the leader of a whole group of Conservatives who'd switch from one side to the other in a dramatic method which might even shift the balance of power. But quite typically for him, he's not such a great team player. People don't necessarily want to follow him, even if they admire his rhetorical skills. So he ends up doing a one-man switch, really, rather than leading this sort of great new movement. I think he would have liked to have started a so-called centre party. He certainly talked about that in the years before. I think that was always his ambition, actually, going through almost to the 1950s, but he never pulled it off.
I agree. And particularly if you read Paul Addison on that, Churchill always wanted a center party. And that's why I think it became easy for him to rat and then re-rat later on, which we'll get to later in this story. But what is true, I think, is Churchill did have political instinct. And in 1906, what he had imagined would happen did happen. And that was that the Conservatives lost enormously to the Liberals. 400 Liberals against only 157 Conservatives, the worst Tory defeat in nearly a century. This is a huge landslide.
Yeah, it's comparable with the Tory defeats of 1945, 1997, and actually even worse for the Conservatives, 2024. And
Yeah.
so this was, in a sense, for a long time, 1906 set the bar for the worst thing that could happen to the Conservative Party. It's kind of been exceeded since then, but it took well over 100 years for such a bad electoral defeat to happen again.
As President Obama said, they got a shellacking.
Yeah, that's right. So you might well say, well, why didn't the Liberals then rule forever? And we'll come to that. In a sense, it's a more fragile victory for the Liberals than first appeared. But of course, it is something which gives both Lloyd George and Churchill their first chances of office. And of course, the measure of the difference between the two is that Lloyd George gets a seat in the cabinet. He's president of the Board of Trade, so minister with the responsibility for trade and various other economic issues. Not the most senior position, not the most junior position, and he's clearly somebody who is going to take what might have seemed a bit of a political backwater and actually put it at the center of politics. Whereas Churchill, who was younger and more junior, had to settle for being a junior minister, secretary for the colonies. He's outside the cabinet. He has a cabinet minister, Lord Elgin, as his boss.
Yeah.
But again, there are opportunities for Churchill here because Elgin is in the House of Lords, which means that when announcements have to be made about Colonial Office affairs or debates have to be led in the House of Commons, then it's Churchill who ends up doing that.
Well, and also, isn't it this idea that Churchill, as an undersecretary, he's not very polished, right? He was seen certainly as tactless. He would go tell delegates that Britain would not give a farthing's preference on a single peppercorn, whereas Lloyd George is being far more erudite.
Yeah. So this colonial conference held in London in 1907 is an area which brings the two men to an issue which they both have to contribute to. And again, so that the people from Australia, and other parts of the empire are all there, and many of them are keen on tariff reform, which of course the British electorate has just rejected. So Churchill is trying to say, we're going to stick with free trade and we're not going to make any concessions whatsoever, which of course alienates a lot of these men who've come from far-flung parts of the empire, whereas Lloyd George smoothed things over, and he is this great conciliator. He is somebody who's incredibly good. I think we maybe should have mentioned what a good speaker he was, but also he was a great negotiator. And as president of the Board of Trade, he had lots of responsibility for trying to solve industrial disputes, and he could charm both sides, the employers and the union representatives. And of course, this was an incredibly important political skill. And and Churchill, by contrast, just doesn't have that level of finesse.
Yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong in this, but I remember reading that during 1907, towards the end of 1907, Lord Elgin basically sends Churchill off on an adventure in Africa just to get him out of the way. That he was actually being more of a problem and hindrance to the liberal program. So they thought, what can we do with him?
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, go on a tour, go check out some of the colonial holdings." So Churchill writes a great thing about hunting and about his trip to. It's called My
Yeah.
African Journey.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it actually merit a whole series. But of course, you're right. And in those days, politics was at a slightly slower pace. So on that occasion, there was Parliament. There was no autumn session of Parliament, which meant basically Churchill could go away for several months. And I think Elgin slightly regretted it because as soon as Churchill arrived in Africa, he still started sending proposals by every post to what Elgin ought to be doing. But basically, he comes back from Africa. I think his mind then is actually starting to turn more in the direction of social reform. And
Mhm.
bear in mind, we should have said that the Prime Minister from 1905 to 1908, the Liberal Prime Minister was Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, who was this very old-fashioned, relatively placid Victorian Liberal. And the government has run into difficulties because it has come into power saying, right, we're going to stick with free trade. Great. Well, you don't actually need to implement any new policies to stick with free trade. So what do you do? What's your government's agenda? And then we mentioned the problems over education as well, which have continued to rumble on and be very controversial, have in fact damaged the Conservatives quite a lot. But then when the Liberals try to do their own reforms, they get stuck in the sand, so that at the point where Campbell Bannerman has to retire through ill health and is replaced by H. Asquith, a somewhat more modern, dynamic figure, then it is about the Liberals trying to find a way forward to reestablish momentum. And a lot of this comes through putting through various kinds of social reform. And this will be crucial for both Lloyd George and Churchill. And so Lloyd George becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer, finance minister in terminology of other countries, with responsibility for creating the annual budget. So really the second most important politician in the country for sure. And Churchill gets Lloyd George's old job as president of the Board of Trade. So he finally entered the cabinet and really reached the top level of politics.
So 1908 becomes a big year for Winston Churchill because not only is he elevated to a cabinet level position, he also gets married to Clementine Hosier, who becomes, of course, Clementine Churchill. And what's really interesting is this links Lloyd George together because Lloyd George was there at Churchill's wedding and actually signed the register. I mean, he was one of the few cabinet members who was there. So there's a literal personal connection. You can see their friendship growing in a literal, like we can prove this with documentation kind of way.
Yeah. And so in summary, by 1908, they're both in the cabinet. They've both reached a very high level of politics. Lloyd George is still the senior partner in this relationship. And after they got over their initial suspicions, I suppose you could say that up until this point, they've worked harmoniously. But as we'll see in the next episode, the years from 1908 to 1914, although they continued to work in partnership, there were also new, powerful tensions which at times threatened to pull this relationship apart. By 1908, Lloyd George and Churchill were the rising stars of liberal Britain.
The junior partner and the Welsh wizard were about to reshape British politics together.
But success would soon bring new tensions.
Next time, we meet the Heavenly Twins as they battle the House of Lords, build the welfare state, and edge towards the First World War.
And if you'd like to continue the discussion,
join our LinkedIn group and stay in touch with the podcast community.
And in the meantime, KBO.